Stream now on your smart TVs.
Hello and welcome to this brand new edition of Global Lens on News9 Live with me, Neha Khanna. As always, we have a packed show for you with all the top news stories from around the world. Let's get started with our big focus tonight. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres has urged Israel to stop its operation in the West Bank, saying it is fueling an already explosive situation. On Wednesday, Israel began what it calls a counter-terrorism operation in 4 areas of the occupied West Bank, with at least 9 people killed. Hundreds of Israeli troops, backed by helicopters, drones and armored personnel carriers, raided the flashpoint cities of Jenin and Tulkarem and other areas in the occupied West Bank. The raids are believed to be the first time since the Second Intifada, a major Palestinian uprising from 2000 to 2005, that several Palestinian cities have been targeted simultaneously. On the second day of the raids, Israel's military says it has killed 5 terrorists who had hidden in a mosque in the occupied West Bank. In a statement, the military says those killed were hidden inside a mosque in Tulkarem near the boundary with Israel. This follows at least 4 airstrikes by the Israeli security forces in the Nur Shams refugee camp in Tulkarem on Monday night that left 5 people dead. These were 3 Palestinian men and 2 boys aged 13 and 15. The UN Human Rights Office says 3 of these people, including the 2 boys, were killed while they were passing by the targeted house, which was located in one of the small and cramped alleyways in the refugee camp. The UN office has warned that the situation in the occupied West Bank could worsen dramatically if ISF continue to systematically use unlawful lethal force and ignore violence perpetrated by Israeli settlers. The latest confirmed toll from the UN Human Rights Office indicates that 628 Palestinians have been killed in the West Bank between 7th October last year, the date of the Hamas-led terror attacks in Israel that sparked the Gaza war, and the 27th of August. That was 2 days ago. The UN Human Rights Office has not only condemned the Israeli forces' increasingly military response in the West Bank, it also maintains that its operations have violated international humanitarian law. A statement issued by the UN Human Rights Office says the ISF use of airstrikes and other military weapons and tactics violate these standards and are resulting in extrajudicial executions and other unlawful killings and destruction of Palestinian homes and infrastructure. The biggest military action in years by Israel in the occupied West Bank has brought the territory into renewed focus. The West Bank, so-called because it extends from the West Bank of the River Jordan, is a chunk of land partially surrounded by Israel. It is home to an estimated 3 million Palestinians and is seen by international bodies as part of the occupied Palestinian territories, which also include East Jerusalem and Gaza. The West Bank has been occupied by Israel since the 1967 Middle East War. Israel has overall control of the West Bank since the 1990s. A Palestinian government known as the Palestinian Authority has run most of its towns and cities. Gaza, on the other hand, has been run by Hamas. Israel has built more than 130 settlements, housing about 500,000 Jews in West Bank. These settlements are considered illegal under international law, though Israel disputes this. The Palestinians have always opposed Israel's presence in the West Bank as well as occupied East Jerusalem and the Gaza Strip, and conflict there has continued over the past 5 decades. Palestinians want the land to be part of a future independent Palestinian state, something backed by the vast majority of the international community, including Israel's closest ally, the United States. But Israel says it will not consider this and that it must always keep hold of some of the West Bank for its security needs. Even as the 10-month-old Gaza war still rages on, the Israeli army has significantly increased its use of airstrikes in the West Bank in recent months. It appears to show a marked shift in the Israeli leadership's assessment of the situation in the West Bank. Since June 2023, Israel has carried out 50 airstrikes in the West Bank, something it had not done since 2006. All but 2 of these airstrikes were carried out after Hamas's attack on Israel on the 7th of October last year. The Israeli airstrikes have been mostly concentrated in Jenin and its nearby refugee camp, a stronghold of Palestinian militants that has emerged as a symbol of resistance against Israeli army raids. Reports say that all roads to Jenin except one have been blocked by Israeli forces. Local taxi drivers have been quoted as saying that Israeli soldiers have been shooting at Palestinian cars. In the city centre, which is normally bustling and packed with shoppers and traffic, the streets are now deserted, with nearly all businesses shut. People are holed up in their houses, waiting for Israel's military operation to end. Palestinian mobile phone networks are also down. As raids in the West Bank continue, a Palestinian politician says Israel is attempting to bring the war from Gaza to the West Bank. Mustafa Barghouti, the Secretary General and co-founder of the Palestinian National Initiative, a political party in the occupied West Bank, says he fears that this latest military operation constitutes a dangerous escalation. Barghouti says it is clear that the Israeli army is trying to bring the war from Gaza to the West Bank. They are using military arsenal to attack people who are under occupation, which is a grave violation of international order. The UN Human Rights Office agrees that this is indeed a violation of international law, but Israel claims that its forces are targeting terror groups and terror cells in the West Bank. The US has urged Israel to take all feasible measures to protect civilian lives in the West Bank. In a statement, a State Department spokesperson said, "We recognize Israel's very real security needs, which include countering terrorist activity in the West Bank. At the same time, we continue to insist that Israeli authorities take measures to protect all civilians from harm." The White House remains deeply concerned about maintaining stability in the West Bank. With the war in Gaza still raging and no signs of a ceasefire, Israel's biggest operation in the West Bank in 20 years is causing international alarm. As we said, the UN chief has said these dangerous developments are fueling an already explosive situation. The European Union Foreign Policy Chief, Josep Borrell, has warned against a war extension from Gaza. The European Union's Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid and Crisis Management has said the situation in the occupied West Bank is deteriorating further and is in violation of international law and human rights. Palestinians say there have been casualties and damage to homes and infrastructure in Jenin, Tulkarem, Nablus and Tubas. The Israeli military describes it as a counter-terrorism operation and says it has made arrests and found weapons and sites used by Palestinian armed groups, including a command room and an explosive lab in a mosque. The UN Human Rights Office has said there are daily settler attacks on Palestinians, including settlers physically assaulting Palestinians, setting fire to or damaging their property and crops, stealing sheep, blocking them from accessing their own land, water and grazing areas, and forcing them to often leave their homes and lands. The OHCHR adds that the long-standing trend of settler attacks on Palestinians has dramatically escalated since 7th October with the support of the highest levels of Israeli government. And Palestinians in the West Bank live in constant fear. It says the Israeli settlers are getting more and more organized, including by using WhatsApp groups and other ways of communication. According to the UN Aid Coordination Office, since 7th October 2023, 259 Palestinian households, that's 1,547 people, including 753 children, have been forcibly displaced amid incidents involving Israeli settlers. The Israeli media, quoting Israeli military sources, is expecting the raids to continue for several days, which means the death toll is expected to rise sharply, particularly as the cities and villages being attacked are full of Palestinian civilians. Israel itself is describing the assault as the biggest of its kind in the West Bank since 2002, when the Palestinian territory was in the middle of the second intifada or uprising. At the time, Israel was criticized for the heavy-handed nature of its response to an initial wave of non-violent demonstrations and civil disobedience. By the end of the Intifada in 2005, Israel had killed 4,793 Palestinians. Israeli casualties are estimated to have been around 1,000. As for the current situation, apart from the new massive operation launched by Israel on Wednesday, what's equally problematic is the fact that control of construction and responsibility for policing in the West Bank is now overseen by two of Israel's most controversial and pro-settler government ministers, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich and Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir. Both have spoken in favor of further Israeli expansion within the Palestinian territory, and both have been repeatedly accused of supporting settler violence against Palestinian citizens within the territory. And now, with the attacks in the West Bank continuing, Foreign Minister Israel Katz has called for the temporary evacuation of Palestinians from the West Bank, raising the fear that Israel may be attempting to engineer the forced displacement of Palestinians from the territory. The question is, just what is Israel's strategy here? Is it indeed bringing the war from Gaza to the West Bank?
IDF forces began this counter-terrorism operation in Jenin and Tulkarm. We are targeting armed terrorists from the air and the ground, dismantling explosives planted under the road and confiscating large quantities of weapons. Now, in Jenin, 3 armed terrorists who posed a threat to our forces were eliminated in an aerial strike. In Jenin and Tulkarm, our forces eliminated 2 more armed terrorists. We apprehended wanted suspects. We located and confiscated weapons, M16s, ammunition, and additional military equipment.
A major operation by Israeli security forces in the occupied West Bank risks seriously deepening an already catastrophic situation. Israel's operations in Jenin, in Tubas, and in Tulkarm today takes the overall death toll in the West Bank since 7th of October to 637 people killed. Many children have been killed while throwing stones at highly protected Israeli security forces, as have other Palestinians posing no imminent threat to life. Thousands of Palestinians have also been arbitrarily arrested and tortured, subjected to unrelenting settler violence, severe restrictions on their movement and expression, with their homes and property destroyed or seized, or forcibly displaced. Israel, as the occupying power, must abide by its obligations under international law. The Israeli security forces' use of airstrikes and other military weapons and tactics violates human rights norms and standards.
נכנסנו לכאן עם רחפן בצילום פנים, ואנחנו ישר מזהים בכניסה חמ"ל מצלמות, מאותר בתמונות של שהידים, חמושים, תמונות של מחבלים. החמ"ל, כמו שאפשר לראות, מחובר עם כבלים שמשדרים את המצלמות מבחוץ אל פנים החמ"ל, ואפשר לראות את השידורים פה במסך, שכרגע כמובן אין קליטה. זה חמ"ל המצלמות. אפשר לראות פה את השהידים ואת החמושים והמחבלים מהמחנה. אני ממשיך אל המשך המרחב. אנחנו מזהים פה הרבה מכשירים לייצור מטענים, גם רתכת, גם שק אשלגן מולנו, רתכת בצבע כחול כמו שאתם רואים, ובכניסה לחדר פנימי אנחנו מיד מזהים כחלק מהמסגד מספר מטענים שפשוט...
All right, so what exactly does this latest operation in the West Bank really mean? Let's introduce our guest. Joining me on Global Lens tonight is Major Dan Pfefferman. He has been with the Israel Defense Forces in the past. He joins us live from Israel. And our Indian panelist tonight is Ambassador Sanjay Bhattacharya, former Secretary Overseas Affairs with the Ministry of External Affairs. Gentlemen, please stay on with me. I need to take a quick break here on Global Lens. We'll have this conversation on the other side.
Hey, careful, huh? My daddy got it from abroad. Hey, disaster! How will you pay for the loss now?
In stock market, you should take risk as per your capacity and knowledge. Trade in options very carefully.
Wow, Dikra! Absolutely perfect. Take risk with full understanding.
Soch kar, samajh kar, invest kar. how do you fulfill that promise? Because ultimately expectations have to be met. If you look at the political landscape, is it really changing for women? And what is the inability of the forces that dead bodies surface but not the living people?
Joe Biden is not going to be the Democratic presidential nominee.
I made my choice. Kamala Harris. She's experienced. She's tough. She's capable.
I took on perpetrators of all kinds. Predators. So hear me when I say, I know Donald Trump's type.
I am the one saving democracy.
He has tapped into the fear and anxiety about demographic change in the US.
This polarization in the United States. Some people are even suggesting that there could be a civil war.
You are this unable to solve your own domestic problems. You have no right to claim to be anybody else in the world, and we're moving into a multipolar world where the United States will not lead.
This and more. Streaming on News9 Plus. Subscribe and get free vouchers.
Welcome back. You're watching Global Lens on News9 Live with me, Neha Khanna, and our big focus tonight is on the latest and massive operation launched by Israel in the West Bank. What could its implications be, and what is Israel's strategy here? Well, let's discuss this with our panel of experts. Let me go across first to Ambassador Sanjay Bhattacharya, former Secretary with the Ministry of External Affairs. Ambassador Bhattacharya, welcome to Global Lens. Let me ask you a straight question. While there has been criticism of Israeli action in West Bank for a long time, especially of the growing settler violence against Palestinians there, including by Israel's closest ally, the United States, what's happening since yesterday is raising alarm bells around the world. What do you think Israel's strategy here really is? There are some Palestinians who say that, well, Israel is trying to actually bring the war from Gaza to the West Bank. How do you see this?
Well, I think there is certainly a degree of concern about the expansion and the incremental steps that are being taken in terms of expanding the scope of the war. The war initially was against the Palestinians, and although the focus was on Gaza, where it has been in operation for over 10 months, what we have seen is that there were several instances where there were attacks and operations even on the West Bank in the past. A lot of this was settler related. But I think the kind of action that we are seeing in the last couple of days by a combined element of Israeli defense and other security forces is of a different nature altogether. And although the target in this particular instance is on certain terrorist elements that have been identified and being targeted, very often what happens in the case of war, and we've seen this in Gaza as well, that the kind of devastation that the Israeli security forces bring upon the theater of war is actually very devastating, including its impact on children, on hospitals, and so on. So one does hope that Israel will seize this violence, because this is not necessary to expand it at this scale and at this time, and to secure its peace, because I do feel that it is compromising its own security by these actions.
That's important. Israel may be compromising its own security by these actions. Let me now go across to our Israeli guest, Major Dan Pfefferman. Major Pfefferman, we know that this is the biggest operation launched by Israel in the West Bank in 20 years. And let me just very quickly read out to you some of the reactions that have come in over the last couple of days. The UN Human Rights Office has said what's happening in the West Bank is a violation of international law. The UN chief, Antonio Guterres, has said these dangerous developments are fueling an already explosive situation. The EU foreign policy chief, Josep Borrell, has said this is a war extension from Gaza. EU's Commissioner for Humanitarian Aid and Crisis Management says the situation in the occupied West Bank is deteriorating further and is in violation of international law and human rights. And as I mentioned earlier, Mustafa Barghouti, the Secretary General of the Palestinian National Initiative, says it is clear that the Israeli army is trying to bring the war from Gaza to the West Bank. Now, Israel hasn't shown much concern really about the opinion of the international community since the beginning of its war against Hamas in Gaza. But what is happening in the West Bank now is raising a lot of eyebrows. Just what is the strategy here?
Sure. Now, first of all, I have always found it absolutely fascinating, the vast gap between the reality on the ground and what's being reported by international media in the United Nations in regards to what happens in Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, whatever you want to call it. Happy to invite you yourself to come report. I know there's a lot of different top-level Indian journalists here reporting. What is the violation of international law in these cities throughout the West Bank is the fact that these have been strongholds for terrorism, and that last week a major suicide bombing was thwarted by chance because the suicide bomber messed up and bumbled the explosive and exploded themselves in Tel Aviv. There are constant and ongoing terrorist attacks that are thwarted at different stages or conducted throughout the West Bank. Nearly 30 Israeli civilians or soldiers, off-duty soldiers, have been killed by Palestinian terrorism over the last year since the October 7th attack. The October 7th attack, I'm glad Mr. Barghouti, Dr. Barghouti, says Israel's trying to expand the war that Israel didn't start in Gaza and didn't want. And Israel prefers to have quiet and stability in the West Bank, in Israel, in Gaza, and wherever. However, these places have become strongholds of lack of law and order. And when terrorism reaches a certain level, Israeli forces are forced to come in and do what Palestinian security services do not do. And that's their job, and that's to prevent terrorism. We have to differentiate that from the reports of Israeli settler violence against Palestinians. And any time that such unlawful activity is taken by Israeli civilians against Palestinian civilians, that should be condemned. And I am clear in my condemnation of any unprovoked violence against Palestinian civilians. And that should be separated from what the Israeli military is doing to thwart and take out terrorist infrastructure that is building and bubbling up in Palestinian cities. You see mosques being used as places to prepare explosives and as military strongholds. You see roads that have had roadside bombs, improvised explosive devices placed underneath it, forcing Israeli forces and bulldozers to come in and take up those roads to prevent those. Israel has zero interest in expanding any kind of war into the West Bank. This has no connection to what's happening in Gaza. This is a continuation of Israel's strategy, whether you like it or dislike it, of preventing major terrorist attacks on Israeli civilians, on Israeli cities, and that's how it should be viewed. So if there's any transgression of international law, it's that Palestinians once again are preparing and trying to launch terrorist attacks, and Israeli military has to take it into its own hands to prevent those terrorist attacks.
All right. You say Israel has no intention of expanding the war. Well, the facts on the ground seem to suggest otherwise. I'm glad you say that the violence by Israeli settlers against Palestinians needs to be condemned. But surely it should have gone way beyond condemnation by now, because I do not think there has been any action against them by the Israeli authorities, despite the fact that your closest ally, the United States, has raised concern repeatedly over this and also, in fact, imposed sanctions on some of those Israeli settlers who've been accused of violence. Yet I don't think we've seen any action whatsoever against them by the Israeli authorities. On the contrary, it is widely believed that they are encouraged. And part of the problem is this, if I could just point this out for our viewers, that two of the most hawkish, far-right and pro-settler ministers in the Israeli government, Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich and National Security Minister, by far the most controversial, Itamar Ben-Gvir, they have both been given charge of construction in West Bank and responsibility for policing in West Bank. That itself sends out a very, very wrong message. And add to this, Ambassador Bhattacharya, the fact that, you know, the Foreign Minister of Israel, Israel Katz, says there should be temporary evacuation of Palestinians from the West Bank. Now, when you're going to make statements like this, people are going to question your intent. There will be fears that Israel is perhaps planning to engineer forced displacement of Palestinians from the West Bank.
I think, most of us are very understanding of the need for security, for stability and prosperity in the region. However, it is also important to recognize that such situation cannot come about when violence continues in a scale that we have seen in Gaza and actually also in the West Bank. It is time to recognize that the use of violence, of military force, will not provide solutions. And in fact, and that's what I was saying earlier, to my horror, I think it actually undermines the security of Israel, which we would very much wish that they have. They should really move towards some kind of negotiated settlements which recognize the two-state formula. This is something that has been recognized across many Israeli governments, have had comments on that. But I think the kind of action that we are doing, the cult of violence that is being perpetuated, takes us away further and further. And a region that is very dear to us and people who are very, very dear to us are in this cycle of violence. So it disturbs us very much when we see this happening, and the escalation and the expansion of conflict, come what others might say, that's what is happening over there. Of course, I understand the sentiments about terrorist activities, but very often the kinds of actions that security forces do, even when they are dealing with terrorist activities, often lead to consequences which are on civilian activities, on civilians, and on children. And we've seen this happen time and again. So I think there is need for caution. There is need to step back and to go to the negotiating table.
Before I take this back to our Israeli guest, Ambassador Bhattacharya, I want to ask you this question. You believe quite firmly that Israel may be undermining its own safety by these actions, but I want to ask you a larger question. I think, and I'm only playing the devil's advocate here, I think it would be safe to say that Israel, lost the confidence of the vast majority of the international community a while ago with its ongoing operations in Gaza. And even though there have been repeated calls for a ceasefire, Israel has been digging its heels in. The war has now gone on for 10 months. According to the Gazan Health Ministry, more than 40,000 Palestinians, including scores of women and children, have been killed in the Gaza Strip. Now that we see this expansion of sorts in the West Bank, is it not, natural that people are going to see this as further aggression on part of Israel? I know that the international community has failed to bring pressure to bear on Israel, even as far as the Gaza war is concerned. But how do you think the international community needs to react to what's happening in the West Bank?
I firmly believe Israel is entitled to its own security. But I think that there was a very important point that you made, that its confidence and credibility in the international community has been diluted by the kind of violence it has let out in Gaza. And I think what is of equally great concern to me is that its credibility with its own people, the Israelis, is being undermined by this continuing cycle of violence that is being perpetuated. And I think that is to me, of even greater concern because the divide within Israel is growing sharper by the day.
Okay, let's take that to our Israeli friend. Dan, I'll give you the last word as we wrap up this discussion. You've heard the ambassador there. He says, you know, the trouble is not only did Israel lose its credibility with the international community a while ago, or at least it's been diluted significantly, its credibility, the government's credibility with its own people is at an all-time low. As you're well aware, the war has gone on for 10 months already and 100 hostages are yet to return home. So my point really is that Israel doesn't really seem to be helping its own cause through these actions.
Yeah, that's, you know, I wish I could disagree with you, but it is true that a majority today of Israelis are unhappy with the current government. They sense there is not a clear strategy to end or to win this war. And while they do trust the Israel Defense Forces, and the Israel Defense Forces works in an incredibly professional manner, and really with the top level of international standards for a war that has not been seen in modern history, that is to be separate from the political level. I want to point out just something that you said previously, and that is I think international audiences tend to misunderstand the raucous nature of Israeli politics. And so you will have figures such as Ben Gvir, such as Smotrich, the ministers, or even as Israel Katz, the foreign minister, who say bombastic things or incredibly hawkish things. And it's important to understand that they do not set or control defense policy. They do not control the policy over what's happening in the Gaza war, or even really in the West Bank and Judea and Samaria. And so we need to separate what certain ministers say to play to their domestic audiences versus what the government actually says and does. At the end of the day, it is what the prime minister and the defense minister say and do that controls that policy. I also want to point out, in response to what the ambassador said, Israel has agreed in the past multiple times to various two-state solution offers, and those were met. I remind you, in 2000 with the Second Intifada, what was then seemed to be an unprecedented wave of suicide bombers and terrorist attacks. Israel unilaterally left Gaza in 2005, and Hamas immediately takes over and has launched now 7 rounds of fighting, this being the biggest, but not the first. And, half of the Palestinian leadership, even more, is dominated by Hamas. If free and fair elections were to be held today in the Palestinian Authority, they have not since 2005, Hamas would easily defeat the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority, which is supposedly the moderates, have refused to come to the table for multiple types of negotiations. And so Israeli society, I believe, understandably, has been scarred and shifted to the right on anything related to the two-state solution. I would like to see a resolution of this conflict by diplomatic means as well. Okay. I think most Israelis would like to see that as well, but it would be nice to hear the international community first and foremost come out and condemn Palestinian terrorism against Israel, against Israeli civilians, except
to be honest, I don't think there is a single right-minded person in the world who did not condemn the terror attack that we saw in Israel on the 7th of October. And it's interesting you say that if there were to be an election in Gaza today, Hamas would beat the Palestinian Authority hands down. Let me also tell you, let me also tell you that if there were to be an election in Israel today, we can all agree that Netanyahu would be sent packing. We can all agree on that. And it's, it's also... I think that's really the sentiment of a vast majority of Israelis today. And also it's interesting you say that, these controversial, hawkish ministers such as Smotrich and Ben Gvir and Israel Katz do not necessarily reflect, what the government is doing or what the vast majority of Israelis really think or believe in. But the trouble is that your Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who are obviously, running Israel's war strategy, are no less hawkish and are on record as having ruled out categorically the two-state solution. Therefore, where is the solution really going to emerge from? Well, I'm completely out of time. So Major Dan Pfefferman and Ambassador Sanjay Bhattacharya, Thank you so much to both of you for joining me on Global Lens tonight. All right, time for us to take a quick break, but on the other side, we have a lot more for you, including the latest on the sensational arrest of Telegram founder Pavel Durov.
Fast.
My God, isn't she your daughter?
Yes.
She's playing football. This is boys' game. Make her study. If she doesn't get a good job, she will get a good match. Will you win the world by playing football?
Yes, auntie. My daughter will win the world by playing football.
Let's go to Germany.
World's largest football talent hunt, News9 Indian Tigers and Tigresses. In association with DFB Pokal, Bundesliga, BBB and India Football Center. Train and play matches in Europe. Register now and fly to Germany. IndianTigersandTigresses.com.
Big fan of Ian Bell, watching him very classy in all formats.
I find Durban quite a challenge, which is still an enjoyable one.
You're not allowed to bowl a bouncer, so that tells you that they want to see runs on the board.
बड़े अच्छे टूर्स किए हैं, बड़ी अच्छी यादें हैं हर जगह की, जहाँ मैंने पर्सनली क्रिकेट को बहुत एंजॉय किया, ऑस्ट्रेलिया एंड इंडिया में बहुत ज़्यादा एंजॉय किया.
I love playing again England and India, and they were both very different challenges.
Up close and personal with legendary cricketers like never before. Icons of the pitch. This and more. Streaming on News9 plus news is now content. Subscribe and get free vouchers.
Why is the state not looking at putting an embargo on that?
As a Telangana person, I will not accept.
How do ordinary folks deal with this?
A Muktiwani Yoda was aide to Sheikh Mujibur, came to my show. I told him that the family of Sheikh Mujibur under captivity of the Pakistani forces. The first lady came with Sheikh Mujibur and she embraced me and said, the God, the Allah has sent you to save us. Modi ji and the Hasina. During talk, she brought out this point again, that Major Ashok Tara of Indian Army said me, my mother, my sister, my brother, we got independent on 17th December because of Ashok Tara.
This and more. Streaming on News9 plus news is now content. Subscribe and get free vouchers.
Welcome back. You're watching Global Lens on News9 Live with me, Neha Khanna. Let's now get your complete lowdown on the arrest of Telegram founder Durov. Now, France has banned Telegram CEO Pavel Durov from leaving the country as the French authorities have charged him in an investigation linked to organized crime on his messaging app. Russian-born Pavel Durov was arrested last Saturday near Paris and released yesterday after 4 days of questioning. French law enforcement agencies have filed preliminary charges in connection with the probe, and investigative judges ordered Durov to pay 5 million euros as bail bond. The French judge also ordered the tech mogul to report to a police station twice a week. Pavel Durov, who has French citizenship, faces prosecution over alleged failure to suppress spread of sexual images of children and calls for violence.
The founder and CEO of the Telegram messaging app, Pavel Durov, was placed under formal investigation by a French judge on Wednesday. The Russian-born tech billionaire was ordered to pay bail of 5 million euros and must report twice a week to police and is barred from leaving French territory. Durov was arrested at an airport near Paris over the weekend and placed in custody as part of a broad investigation into organized crime on Telegram. The judge found there were grounds to formally investigate Durov on all the charges he was initially arrested for, including suspected complicity in running an online platform that allows illicit transactions, child pornography, drug trafficking, and fraud. He was also charged with refusing to communicate information to authorities, money laundering, and providing cryptographic services to criminals. Durov's lawyer did not immediately respond to a request for comment. The 39-year-old's detention has fueled debate on where freedom of speech ends and enforcement of the law begins. In places like Latvia, which borders Russia and Belarus, the Telegram app with its encryption is widely popular as a safe tool for communication and trading sensitive news. Founder of the Digital Security Center, Elvis Strasdens.
Yeah, it's probably not the most popular chatting app here, but it's popular among certain groups of people, like people who want to do something probably illegal, like sell or buy drugs, or find some shady jobs like scamming or selling their bank accounts or buying bank accounts to do money laundering and stuff like that. Of course, it's also used for legal purposes, but it's probably popular because of the reasons I mentioned before.
Durov's arrest underlines the uneasy relationship between governments and Telegram, which has close to 1 billion users, while serving as a warning shot to tech titans who refuse to comply with authorities over alleged illegality on their platforms.
Let's now turn our attention to Hong Kong, and it is not good news for journalists. 2 journalists who led a pro-democracy newspaper in Hong Kong have been found guilty of sedition. Chung Pui Kuen and Patrick Lam, 2 editors at the now defunct Stand News media outlet, could now face up to 2 years in prison. This is the first sedition case against journalists in Hong Kong since the territory's handover from Britain to China in 1997. Their newspaper's editorial line supported Hong Kong local autonomy, according to the district court judge who found the pair guilty. The judge has ruled that the newspaper had become a danger to national security.
A Hong Kong court on Thursday found 2 editors at the now defunct Stand News media outlet guilty of sedition. This is the first sedition conviction against any journalist or editor since Hong Kong's handover from Britain to China in 1997. The case has received international scrutiny amid a security crackdown in the China-ruled city. The 2 editors, Chung Pui Kuen and Patrick Lam, who wasn't there for the verdict, could face a maximum jail term of 2 years. Stand News was once a leading online media platform in Hong Kong, featuring a mix of critical reportage and commentary. And critics of this case, including the US government, say the verdict reflects deteriorating media freedoms in the city. Stand News was raided by police in December 2021 and had its assets frozen, leading to its closure a few days later. The editors and the outlet's parent company were all charged with conspiracy to publish seditious publications in connection with 17 news articles and commentaries from July 2020 to December 2021. The articles included commentaries written by exiled activists. The editors pleaded not guilty. During the 57-day trial, the government prosecutor said Stand News had acted as a political platform to promote, quote, illegal ideologies and incited readers' hatred against the Chinese and Hong Kong governments. When testifying in court, Chung said the site had simply sought to reflect a spectrum of voices, including pro-democracy advocates. The judge wrote in a summary that the court had considered, quote, the potential damage to national security in its ruling on seditious intent.
Let's now get you the latest on Typhoon Shanshan that hit Japan earlier today. Millions of people have been ordered to evacuate their homes as Typhoon Shanshan lashed southwest Japan with strong winds and torrential rain today, knocking out power, snarling air traffic and forcing major factories to close. At least 3 people have been killed so far and scores of others injured in what authorities have warned could be one of the strongest ever storms to hit the region.
More than 5 million people have been told to evacuate from their homes as Typhoon Shanshan lashed southwest Japan on Thursday. After hovering over the southerly Kyushu island for the next few days, The storm is expected to approach Tokyo around the weekend, the country's weather agency said. Strong winds and heavy rain knocked out power and forced major factories to close. Authorities warned Shanshan could be one of the strongest ever storms to hit the region, as they assessed the death toll and reported scores left injured. Toyota suspended operations in all of its domestic plants due to the storm, while Nissan, Honda, and chipmakers Renesas and Tokyo Electron also temporarily halted production at some factories. The typhoon produced gusts of up to 112 miles per hour, according to the weather agency. Around 230,000 households in 7 prefectures were without power in the afternoon, according to Kyushu Electric Power Company. However, the company said there was no impact at its Sendai nuclear power plant in Satsuma Sendai City, where the storm made landfall earlier on Thursday. Airlines announced cancellations of nearly 800 flights. Train services have been suspended in many areas of Kyushu, while hundreds of bus and ferry services have also been halted, according to the Transport Ministry. Typhoon Shanshan is the latest harsh weather system to hit Japan, following Typhoon Pavel, which also led to blackouts and evacuations earlier this month.
Scientists say the new Mpox strain, which has spread from the Democratic Republic of Congo, is evolving faster than anticipated. Experts are facing challenges in tracking the virus due to limited funding and equipment. Mpox, formerly known as monkeypox, is a viral infection causing flu-like symptoms and pus-filled lesions. Although typically mild, in some cases it can be deadly. The virus, which has been in Africa for decades, saw a global surge in 2022. But recently, the World Health Organization declared Mpox a global health emergency.
Scientists studying the new Mpox strain that has spread out of the Democratic Republic of Congo say the virus is changing faster than expected. And it's often happening in areas where experts do not have the funding or equipment to properly track the virus. Reuters spoke to half a dozen scientists in Africa, Europe, and the US who outlined a number of unknowns.
We are still working blindly in Africa.
Dr. Dimye Agoina is an infectious diseases expert in Nigeria who chairs the World Health Organization's Mpox Emergency Committee.
We don't have the required knowledge about Mpox, natural history, transmission dynamics, risk factors of Mpox. You need to understand your disease for you to develop or design preventive strategies against such a disease.
Mpox, formerly known as monkeypox, is a viral infection that causes pus-filled lesions and flu-like symptoms. Cases are usually mild, but they can be deadly. The virus has been around in Africa for decades, but an international surge in 2022 prompted the WHO to declare a global health emergency for about 10 months. Now there's a new strain and a new WHO emergency declaration.
The situation constitutes a public health emergency of international concern.
The UN agency says Congo has had more than 600 Mpox deaths this year and more than 18,000 suspected cases of the new strain and its earlier iteration. There have been cases in 4 other African countries, as well as in Sweden and Thailand among people who had traveled to Africa. Scientists say a response is complicated by several outbreaks happening at once. In some cases, the spread has been linked to human contact with infected animals. It can also spread through close contact with an infected person. Mutated versions of the virus can essentially be considered a sexually transmitted disease, says South African epidemiologist Dr. Salim Abdul Karim, who chairs the Africa CDC's Mpox Advisory Committee.
It's case identification, contact tracing, and vaccinating and monitoring and treating, giving prophylaxis to contacts. So this is not rocket science. We do this for other infections. And so we can do it for Mpox.
An Africa CDC senior official said on Wednesday that the continent has secured less than 10% of an estimated $245 million needed to fight the surging outbreak. And there's no timeline yet on when hundreds of thousands of vaccine doses might reach the DRC.
The UN World Food Programme is investigating two of its top officials in Sudan over allegations including fraud and concealing information from donors about its ability to deliver food aid to civilians amid the nation's dire hunger crisis. The investigation by the Office of the Inspector General comes as the UN's food aid arm is struggling to feed millions of people in war-plagued Sudan, now suffering one of the world's most severe food shortages in years.
As the United Nations World Food Programme struggles to feed millions of people in war-torn Sudan, the humanitarian organization has now launched an investigation into two of its top officials in the country over allegations of fraud and concealing information from donors about its ability to deliver food aid to civilians. That's according to 11 people with knowledge of the investigation. 5 of the sources who spoke to Reuters say investigators are looking at whether WFP staff sought to hide the alleged role of Sudan's army in obstructing aid amid a brutal 16-month war with a rival paramilitary for control of the country. One of the officials being investigated has since been given a temporary duty assignment outside Sudan, while Reuters could not confirm the current role of the other. When asked about the probe, the WFP said, "Allegations of individual misconduct related to irregularities in pockets of our operation in Sudan are under urgent review by its Inspector General's office." Meanwhile, the U.S. government's aid agency, USAID, the single largest donor to the WFP, said the allegations were deeply concerning and must be thoroughly investigated. Battling severe hunger on many fronts, the World Food Programme is currently seeking close to $23 billion in funding to feed millions of people. That includes more than 1 million on the brink of famine, mostly in Sudan and Gaza.
Wildfires that swept Canada's woodlands last year released more greenhouse gases than some of the largest emitting countries. That's what a new study has found, calling into question national emissions budgets that rely on forests to be carbon stores.
Wildfires in Canada's forests last year released more greenhouse gases than some of the world's largest emitting countries. That's according to a study published on Wednesday in the journal Nature. Fires scorched about 37 million acres across the country, or about 4% of Canada's forests. That adds up to 647 megatons of carbon, more than 7 of the 10 biggest national emitters in 2022. Study author Brendan Byrne is an atmospheric scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
In 2023, the carbon emitted by fires in Canada was far outside the previous record. It would rank 4th after the US, China, and India.
Climate change, driven by the burning of fossil fuels, is leading to hotter and drier conditions, which propels extreme fires. Byrne says 2023 could become Canada's new normal.
If we look at climate projections, by the time we get to kind of the 2050s, we start to see this as kind of a normal summer.
The findings add to concerns about depending on the world's forests to act as a long-term carbon sink for industrial emissions, and fires could be making the problem worse. Canada does not include natural phenomena like wildfires in its annual greenhouse gas emissions inventory, according to a 2021 strategy. So the fear is the global carbon budget may be based on inaccurate calculations. That budget is the estimated amount of greenhouse gases the world can keep emitting while holding warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels.
Those estimates are very uncertain. And so if we see these kind of big changes where fires become more common in the boreal forests, we might not see as much carbon taken up from these natural ecosystems as we expect. Keeping the carbon dioxide to a certain level will then require corresponding reductions in the allowable emissions we have.
Well, that's all the time we have on Global Lens tonight. Thanks so much for watching. Do join us again at the same time tomorrow. Good night.
is News9 Live, India's only digital exclusive live stream. For the early adopters, bringing you the news 24/7. For the smart audiences on the smartest TVs. News9 Live. Stream now on your smart TVs.
Digital screens are everywhere, at home, at work, even in our pockets. These devices have made our lives more convenient, but there is a hidden cost. A rather grim condition seems to be on the rise among the younger generation: digital dementia. So what is digital dementia, and how does it impact mental well-being? News9 Plus decodes. Dementia is usually associated with cognitive decline in the elderly, memory loss, slow reasoning, confusion, and mood changes. But digital dementia refers to cognitive changes that arise from excessive use of screen technology. The term digital dementia was coined by the German neuroscientist Manfred Spitzer in 2012. Now, it is important here to emphasize that digital dementia isn't officially recognized as a diagnosable condition. But there's enough scientific support for the idea that excessive use of electronic devices can harm cognitive functions. Research suggests that overusing screen technology may lead to changes similar to those seen in dementia. In fact, it can potentially increase the risk of youngsters developing it. What are the symptoms of digital dementia? Problems with short-term memory, easily losing or forgetting things, difficulty recalling words, and trouble with multitasking. Digital dementia may also cause changes in communication, focus, reasoning,